Oh, sorry. Let's just get back. So, Lindia, is Mabuchi in? Can I start?
He is joining. I've admitted
he's struggling maybe with
connection. He's struggling, with connectivity. Okay, I think he may know. He's
okay. So then let's continue. Okay. So Tanzania participants, let me just give you a quick overview. As I said, I tried to make the session shorter, and my estimation is that we will be done in about an hour and a half. Of course, we've used some time now, but I think we can still catch up. I don't want to rush it. At the same time, I don't want to exhaust you more than is needed. You can see this is the program for today, and we've covered some of that already. Thank you. We got some update on the events for this week. Thank you, Sampeo. And I want to just give you an overview of the program objectives, but also any feedback about the course that you may have when we come to the end, feel so free to share in terms of time slots, in terms of modality, etc. I was saying to Lindia, I am using you guys as guinea pigs today as well, if you forgive me. On the one hand, it is good because we can give you an opportunity to catch up. At the same time, it is also nice to see if we shouldn't sometimes throw things around a little bit and rather have country sessions for specific content, because it seems to me some content can rather be dealt with in this context, and then maybe we also use less time of the country teams, and other content we bring the group together so that you still have that experience sharing with the other countries. So I will see how to balance, and let's see also whether today add value for you beyond just catching up, whether it's helpful sometimes to dig in and discuss the country context in the line with ALESBA. So feel free towards the end of the course if you have any feedback for me as facilitator, for Lindia, and for the modality issues. So today's program, what we're going to do is going to recap last week's session, which many of you missed also because you were so hectic with big programs that side. And then, of course, the presentation for today, the key presentation is yesterday's, which you guys also requested because you couldn't be there. So I'm making those not too long. So it's two presentations which flows the one into the other. So my idea is to continue with them and then do a body break. But if you say we need a body break anytime, please just shout and say, can't listen anymore, want a body break, then feel so free to do that. But my idea is to finish those and then to have a discussion. In yesterday's team, they had group work because it was more than one country. So each country discussed the topics in their groups and then presented back in plenary. I think in the case, since you are all from one country, one team, I think we can go through that discussion all together as a team, and that might maybe be useful because it will contextualize many things, and it will also give feedback for me as a facilitator. And in addition, it saves some time. And then I would like to brief you on the assignment for next week. And then, as I said, if there's any other last questions or any other business, or maybe as a team, you want to stay on 5 minutes longer to arrange your teamwork for next week, then you're also welcome to do so. So that's what is on the menu for today. So the contents, objectives for today's session, I hope that by the end of the session, you'll be familiar with the background, the rationale, the key principles and concepts of the approach. How did it come about? I don't want to dwell too much on this because you can read it in the booklet, but I thought at least to highlight the key points, and that's why I also made it shorter for you guys for today. But it is, I think, important so that you know how the approach developed, that it's not just from thin air, and there is certain foundations part of it, so that when you use it and when you refer to it, you have that background, but we'll not do it in such a heavy fashion. And then the main content, and this was yesterday's session, is to have an understanding of the ALESBA conceptual framework with the 4 system elements and building blocks. And this is the absolute key content, because this conceptual framework will be the essence of all the sessions from here onwards. So I'm really grateful that you guys are here today so that we can go into that in depth and have a thorough understanding for the work that will follow from here onwards, and then of course to brief you on assignment. So those are the content objectives. So let's jump then. This is last week's session that many of you couldn't attend, so I'm doing a brief recap of that first. And all of the contents is in the first booklet, Introduction to the Approach and Toolkit. So feel free to go if you want more details. Sorry, I just want to switch this off. So let's look at where the ALESBA started and now it is grounded. ALESBA as an approach is based on adult learning and education and adult learning education principles. And SMPO, I liked when you said in Tanzania, you take ALE and non-formal learning education. So that already gives me a good starting point. In this context, ALE is used as a terminology that will also incorporate any form of non-formal education. So ALE is understood as adult learning and education in its widest sense, whether it is literacy, whether it's non-formal vocational training, whether it is citizenship education. I think you are all familiar with the wide range of adult education services that exist. And sometimes that even becomes conflict between ourselves as adult educators. But the terminology is used in that context. It is also used because at the time, DVB International and UNESCO and other stakeholders were trying to rebrand adult education. And the terminology that was agreed upon was adult learning and education, but understood that it will also include non-formal education. That said, I quite like the way that Tanzania also make non-formal a very specific component in your definition. And so ALESBA, therefore, adult learning and education system building approach, based on this, and of course taking into consideration the lifelong learning continuum. So that's all the kind of theoretical and principles behind. It acknowledges, as I said, the diversity of ALE as a sector, and then the role of multiple stakeholders, that there is not only one stakeholder. So it's not a government versus NGO or academic versus practitioner situation. To build a system, all stakeholders are needed and all stakeholders should ideally be on board. So I once again really appreciated the initiative of Tanzania this week to invite so many stakeholders and having that opportunity already to have these kind of discussions. The main aim, and I will reiterate this again later, of the ALESBA is to build sustainable ALE systems for optimized service delivery. Please note that I'm referring to ALE service delivery. So that is whether it's literacy classes, whether it's non-formal skills training at the FTC, whether it's agricultural skills training. We refer to it as a service because we feel, we talk about health services, we talk about education services, but we often talk about adult education provision or literacy provision. And so the terminology may seem almost insignificant, but the reason we talk about service delivery, it's also so that we can link it to a rights-based approach where learners have a right to certain services, the same way they have a right to education and other services. And we as duty bearers also have a responsibility to deliver that. So the aim is to build systems that can deliver the best possible services. Okay, the approach was developed. Mabuji, you are welcome. We are happy you joined. Just switch off your microphone, please. Nice that you're with us. So the ALESBA was developed with the action learning. Okay, now I think you can hear me. I was almost muted as well. So I was saying ALESBA was developed through an action learning process since 2014 in the East Horn of Africa region. So at least you are in the region. Unfortunately, that time Tanzania was not a DVV international target country yet. Otherwise, you would have been much more involved. But some of you, I know, have been in the Big Africa training that we had that at least introduced the approach. So it was developed because we had, in the East Africa region, we had many discussions and we started to talk about our frustrations. For example, the fact that with so many efforts by government, by NGOs to deliver literacy, to develop non-formal skills training, and to offer all these services, we still don't reach what we want to reach. When we look at literacy rates in the region at that time and across the Africa continent, our illiteracy rates don't necessarily come down. We still have high unemployment. We have still a lot of needs, youth not in employment, not in education, not in training. So why are all these things happening? And I was joking with the team yesterday. I said, you know, usually when things go wrong, what we do as adult educators, we quickly go and redesign the curriculum, the guidelines, the manuals, and we do a training of trainers. But most often the reasons for that doesn't lie in those kind of things. And I hope as we engage with system building, we will uncover where should we actually make an entry to make the changes, to make the services reach the right people with the right kind of quality. So I will not talk in depth about the action learning process, but this literally means that we would design something, try it, test it, come back, rethink it, debrief it, analyze it before we did the next step. And so it was a good 6 years to develop the approach and come up with the conceptual framework, the phases and the tools as it is now. And that doesn't mean it is done and it is written up. It's a constant evolving approach. And we hope as people use it, you can add value to it. You can even have debates about it. Contribute tools, and the Moja platform is also a very good place where participants that use the approach can upload different tools, experiences, and we will use that more and more as the course continue. So the approach has 5 phases, and I will talk about that a little bit later. And the reason for 5 phases, it's because it takes time to build systems. And I want to reiterate this as well. I had many former colleagues and stakeholders who would say to me, but Sonia, the ALESBA is taking so long. And I would always say, it's not ALESBA that is taking long. It is system building. And I think all of you who's been involved in adult education and learning over the years will know how long it takes to change the wheels, how long it takes to make changes in a system. So the ALESBA is just an approach to help us, to guide us through that long process of system building by demarcating specific phases, by keeping us focused, that we don't just continue with our activities, but that we have a longer overarching goal and objectives towards building a system. So it's a more conscious effort. And as I mentioned, the ALESBA is for all stakeholders interested in improving the ALES system. So from whichever organization, institution you come, you have a role to play. I already mentioned that the approach came about because of the challenges we experience in ALES, specifically in Africa. And I also just to note, especially for newcomers like Malimu, it's captured in 6 booklets that are available on the Moja website and also on the DVV International website. And I remember Lucas said that hard copies are available from the DVV office, so please feel free. All DVV International country offices have hard copies that you are welcome to access. Well, that's a little bit of background. The aim, as I mentioned before, is to optimize ALES service delivery. So the emphasis is the users that need the service. At the same time, to implement ALESBA, the finger is pointed back at us as the service supplier. So we will talk about that later as well. And it is to provide a holistic conceptual framework that can assist stakeholders, all of us, to understand and build ALES systems systematically and sustainably throughout different phases. So every time you say ALE, of course, please replace with your terminology in Tanzania. Some of the underlying principles I already hinted at, but it's about a rights-based approach. So that is part and parcel of the approach. We acknowledge that learners have a right to education, to adult education and learning, and that duty bearers, both state and non-state, have a role to play. Of course, we know state has the biggest responsibility as a duty bearer, but it also asks for non-state actors, what is our role? How do we contribute to make sure services are delivered? So the system is not just built for the government, it's a system that takes all stakeholders into consideration. Other principles is integration, and I'm happy, Simpio, you also mentioned that. And so we look at integration from a horizontal and a vertical perspective. Horizontal meaning between the different sectors that are involved in ALE in a specific country. Often some sectors don't think they are busy with adult learning and education. Agriculture, for example, does a lot of adult education. So does health. Non-formal TVET, since in ALE we mostly talk about non-formal, so non-formal TVET, as I mentioned, citizen education, literacy, there are many different sectors and it varies from country to country. So most often when those services are offered in an integrated manner, the learners get the most benefit. So horizontal integration remains important, and then also vertical integration. How do we make the system work across the spheres of governance? That means from national to provincial, regional, district, and local government level, and up again. So how do we flow information? How does policy get interpreted and implemented at local level? So vertical integration is also a key component. That means we look at it from a micro, meso, macro level. And you will see when we come to the system building blocks, that will come up again. Evidence-based influencing is a principle in the approach. We've seen, and I think all of you know this, as they say, the proof is in the pudding. So if we have good practices, if we have pilot projects that worked well, those are excellent opportunities to advocate for changes at national level or to convince stakeholders to come on board. So evidence-based influencing is used throughout the approach for different means. Participation of stakeholders, participation of learners, partnerships between different stakeholders, and ownership. Ownership of our successes, our failures, our challenges. So to have a proper system, we have to carry it together. And then capacity building. This is not just for our target group or for our learners, but capacity building for everybody that is implementing the system. That means all adult educators, but it also means system managers, people that do M&E, people who do planning. We've had good experiences in Uganda where we would bring people from planning departments on board, and we found that those people actually carry the voices of adult learning and education beyond our sector. So how do we build capacity and give exposure to people who are not usually part of the ALE circle? So capacity building, therefore, for everybody that's involved in designing and implementing the system. Sustainability, of course, a key principle throughout the approach, and I constantly say to our participants, sustainability is not something that you should be worried about towards the end of a project or a program. Sustainability should be from day one. How do you design your activities, your implementation modality, so that if there is no more outside support, still the program can work? So how do we embed our projects, our programs, our services within existing systems and make it affordable so that it can still continue and be efficient and effective? So many considerations for sustainability should be on the table. And that goes close together with institutionalization. I think you all have had this experience where there might be a very good active person in a certain position. And while that person is there, you cooperate very well, things go down on the ground, you can see activities happening. And when that person is no more in the position, things simply fall down. So how do we move beyond that? How do we make sure the system is institutionalized? There will be accountability. New people that come on board will be briefed so that we can really make sure it's a system that holds people accountable, it is documented, it is official. You will know, and once again, this links well with what Sampeo said in the beginning, and I think all stakeholders that has joined us today will agree with that. ALE is usually for the informal and non-formal sector of adult learning and education, so that is the focus of the ALESBA as well. Closely linked to capacity building is the professionalization of adult educators, and we often have, yesterday we had our universities on board as well, and the roles they play, but even as ourselves as direct implementers, if you are an implementing organization, you still do training, you still try to make even our community facilitators at that level have some form of professionalization and a career path as well. And then ALESBA, of course, acknowledges and adheres to national and international commitments, such as the ones made at Conventia, such as the SDGs, etc. A few key concepts that will come up throughout the course and the booklets, and I'm almost done with session 3, so bear with me. I'll stop for questions just now before we do the session 4 catch-up. So we will refer to youth and adults. So it's a diverse range of learner target groups, but mostly within the sphere of youth and adults. And I know each country has different definitions around this. Yesterday, people made a very good point where they said, we focus so much on youth in certain countries that we forgot about the adults. So how do we balance this? And you will know in Africa, most of us have more, our youth is the largest demographic in most countries. So how do we make tailor-made courses for youth, but also then what do we do with adults? How do we combine what's our modalities going to be to implement services in this case? So that's those two concepts will come up. The concept of system building. A system is understood as an entity that consists of different elements and processes which are interconnected and interdependent with feedback loops. So we will look constantly at system building, systems thinking. And you will be surprised that even within the ALESBA, we often still think in silos. So it is a mindset change, a paradigm shift that will be needed, that you have to constantly almost check yourself and say, oh, if I make changes to one thing, how will it affect the others? Or what are the deep-rooted underlying things that relate to this challenge? So we constantly will check ourselves on systems thinking, systems understanding, but also system building. And any system in the context of the ALESBA, of course, and not just the ALESBA, whether you talk about health systems or education systems at large, it relies on the country context and the governance system of the country, as well as the definition you use for ALE. And already you hinted at the Tanzania perspective, and this will make your group assignment quite easy this week, because we need to decide as a team for the purpose of learning, but also for the purpose of you having a practical place where you can not only for your own learning, but in the interest of building a system in Tanzania, we have to decide which slice of the cake are you focusing on. Is it only literacy? Is it non-formal education? What does that mean? So we will engage with that discussion a little bit later today. And so if we wanted to look at the building of an adult learning and education system, we will look at the process of assessing and diagnosing the system. I think last week somebody asked and said, Sonia, do you assume that countries don't have a system at all? No, that's definitely not the case. Every country has a system. Some function better than others, but most systems have some kind of a gap. And so in the ALESBA, we look at the process of assessing the status of the current system, diagnose which challenges and blockages are there so that we have a starting point and see where should we intervene. And with that, we will look at which alternatives are available to redesign and implement an improved system. So we will look at options of testing that improved system, even if you pilot it in smaller areas, so that you can learn from it, make adjustments, scale it up, and ultimately reach a wider target group in all regions, for example, all provinces in the country. I mentioned system thinking throughout, that we have to remember that all parts of the system is connected, and the change in one part will also impact on changes in the other parts. I already mentioned the issue of service delivery, and we will look at it from the demand and the supply side. So please, when you see some participants always say, but I feel we don't talk enough about the target group. We will definitely start the assessment and the design of the system from the perspective of the target group. For example, does the current system address the needs of the target group? We often make that assumption, and you will see in round 2, which is next year's course, we actually will look at how to do a demand assessment to check, do we actually deliver services that are demanded, that is contextual, that is up to date? From that, we look inward and we look at ourselves as the supply side. How do we not only design the correct services, but how do we put a system in place that works interconnectedly to supply those services between all of us as a group of stakeholders? And therefore, we will look at our own structures and the processes that goes through those structures. I hope I don't go too fast and I lose you on the way. This is the last slide for last week's session, and then I will stop for questions or comments. I mentioned that there are 5 phases in the ALESBA. So this first booklet that we are busy with now is just the introduction to the approach. It's to give you an orientation of the approach as a whole, the conceptual framework. And then as of the second booklets, which we will start in about 3 sessions, so about 3-4 weeks later, we are going to look at phase 1, consensus building. And hopefully your Big Adult Education Week already did a lot of work towards building consensus among stakeholders. But we will look at the processes that we have to go through to make sure there's consensus among stakeholders to build a unified adult education system where every stakeholder will play their role within the bigger picture. So phase 1 is about that. And consensus building, some countries are lucky and they have more consensus than others, and you may spend a very short time frame on this. Other countries may take 1 year, 2 years to have sufficient consensus to start actual system building in a very conscious way. And consensus building is not just something you do once off and then you are done. You will know in any kind of relationship you need consensus throughout. So how do we pull the principles of consensus building throughout this long-term process of system building? So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is about assessing and diagnosing the current system. And we do that from both a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. So there is a range of tools available that will help you to even be able to quantify and say, currently our system scores this, but those scores are not just from the top of our heads, they have to rest on certain facts, and that's why we do an assessment. And also then have enough data to diagnose and see where within the system do our challenges lie, to come up with the alternatives, as I mentioned in phase 3, to decide what do we want to change, which alternative and affordable options do we have, and how do we design the improved system, so that in phase 4, we have a kind of a pilot where we can implement and test that improved system, even if it's in a specific smaller district or 3 or 4 districts, before we review again, adjust and upscale. This overall process of system building can take, depending on the status of the country at the time it started, can take 3 years, can take 6 years, can take up to 12 years. It depends. The difference is that we now follow a conscious process of building a system, and we don't just go around, do our work, have good successes, but it doesn't necessarily focus on building a system within a national context, with each small contribution from micro level contributing towards that. So before I move to the next session, let me just stop sharing for a second and ask Lindy, I think we have to unmute our participants. Are there any questions or comments on last week's session before we proceed with the next? And if you need a body break, please let me know as well. Anybody? Shall I proceed? Can I get an indication from participants? Are you still okay? Are you on board? Lindia, are we still muting everybody? No, we've unmuted. Okay. You are muted, Lindia.
Sorry, people can unmute themselves.
Can unmute themselves. Okay, maybe they don't want to unmute themselves. Okay, participants, are you okay? Can I get the indication, even a thumbs up? Can I continue? Or did I burden you sufficiently?
I think you can continue, please. Continue.
I can continue. Thank you. You're still on board. Okay, so let's get, if you don't need a body break, there's just a few more slides. Let me get through that. Then we'll do a body break, and then we will have a bit of discussion to contextualize this in your own context. Okay, so I'm sharing again. Let me just get to that slide's content. Just want to share it widely. There we go. Okay, so this is what you see on your screens now, and of course this is in the booklet. This is the heart of the ALESBA. So keep this framework in mind. And a participant said yesterday, Sonia, these building blocks are not new. We talk about these things like policies, like accountability all the time, and that I absolutely agree, that is true. So the framework is just a way to organize it so that we have a conceptual orientation and that we can refer to it. So this conceptual framework came about through a long process and many workshops and discussions. And finally, as teams in Uganda, Ethiopia, we came up with a suggestion. This was shared with a wider Africa team, and we finally settled on this framework. And you will see that within the framework, we look at 4 system elements. We say we look at the enabling environment. And this means literally what it says, the enabling environment, which is usually at a national level, but it is implemented, of course, at the local level. Things like, do we have a policy for our adult learning and education? Some countries have 2, 3 policies. Some countries have is part of a bigger education policy. So it depends on the context in the country. But is there a policy? Is there an adult learning education strategy? There are specific building blocks under the enabling environment, and I will unpack them more in the next slide. But is there an enabling environment that gives a direction for what we do in adult learning and education in the country? And so that's the one system element. Then next it on the right-hand side, you see institutional arrangements. What kind of institutional arrangements are in place? So this will refer to the different stakeholders that are involved and how they have their own structures, usually in government, and Simpeo, you also hinted at it. You have a unit, and you got, in Tanzania's case, you have the Institute for Adult Education, but other countries may have a specific unit within the Ministry of Education. In Uganda, they have a unit in the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, but there's usually a structure at national level with staff at either provincial, regional, district and local level. So there are different implementation structures within government, but as NGO partners, as academics, there's also structures within our own organizations that deal with this core service of adult learning and education. It might be different services. So how is those structures arranged? How do we talk to each other? Do we have sufficient personnel, the human resources? What accountability mechanisms are there? So all the issues to do with institutional arrangements. And without institutional arrangements, you can imagine services won't be delivered. And then I want to jump to technical processes on the left side. And this is usually our core business as adult educators. So I think you are all very familiar with this. Here we refer to things such as our curricula, capacity building, our program design, the methodologies we use, how do we assess learners. So this is our core business, whether we do literacy or other forms of non-formal skills training, these are the building blocks that help us to deliver that service. And then on the right-hand side at the bottom, we have management processes, which I often refer to as the cement, because if you don't have proper planning, you don't have a budget, you don't monitor, you don't have a management information system, it's very difficult to hold all the other building blocks together. So we say the conceptual framework has 4 system elements: the enabling environment, institutional arrangement, technical processes, management processes. Under each of those 4 system elements, there are a number of building blocks, which I'll go to the next slide. Before that, you will see the circle. So the conceptual framework takes into consideration, I also mentioned this earlier, the governance system of the country. So you have to take this and contextualize it to Tanzania's governance, general governance system. I think if I remember correctly, you have regions. So you'll have national level, regional level, district level. And in some countries, like in Uganda, at community, before you reach community, there is what they would call sub-county level. And then you have your community level where you are at the interface with your learners. And in this level, we usually look at what kind of structures or mechanisms are there to deliver services. Are there community learning centers? Are there FTCs? Are there learners classes, literacy classes? So this is the direct interface with the learners. But we look at the system across these spheres or tiers of governance. And at each level, you will know from experience, certain actions happen that can affect at local level. And if the local level is also not having the means to communicate up, that also will block the system. So the 4 system elements go across these governance levels. It doesn't mean they all each assist, like enabling environment, even though it usually emanates from national level, it's implemented at local level. So please keep in mind all the elements and building blocks fall across all the levels of governance, and that's why there are dotted lines. It means they move around, and the building blocks of each element also plays across. They are interconnected. As we said, the system must have feedback loops. So keep this conceptual framework in mind, please, throughout. I already mentioned the 4 system elements, so that is just a way to arrange also our system building blocks. And this slide, I always apologize that it is presented in the form of a table because it somehow creates silos, but I had to find a way to arrange the building blocks that you can see to which system element they belong. So I'm just going to run through them very briefly because I think you are familiar with many of them, and you can still go back to the booklet and read in more detail. So under enabling environment, obviously we look at policy, whether it is an ALE policy on its own, or whether it's part of an education policy, or in Uganda's case, for example, they have a literacy policy and a community development policy. And what is ultimately delivered as a service actually borrows from both policies. The that has to be discussed. And for each of these building blocks, there is a set of indicators that can give you an idea, what does the ideal building block look like? And Ochola asked a lot of questions about that yesterday, so I suspect in your teamwork, you will have a good discussion around this. So what kind of policy? Is there a policy? Some countries don't even have an ALE policy. The building block beneath that, a strategy. Most often the strategy is either outdated or doesn't exist. Do you have a strategy that explains how the policy will be implemented? Is it updated? Does it keep all stakeholders on board? And then the third building block is maybe not so familiar under the enabling environment, the ALE program implementation guideline. Is there a guideline in the country that will guide all stakeholders, whether it's a small CBO or NGOs or universities, to indicate what are their roles in the wider system and how do they interconnect with the system? I will give a small example. We had a program in Ethiopia that reached out to more than 30,000 women. But the statistics of that program was never acknowledged in the bigger national statistics. So does that really mean you have one national system, or does it mean each of us just do our own thing and it is not a concerted effort to reach as many people as we can with quality services? So a program implementation guideline will explain it. It's a level lower than the strategy, but it will explain how the system works, how stakeholders can come on board. And that doesn't mean every stakeholder have to do the same thing, but it is like a more practical framework, and it will explain how the monitoring system works, etc., etc. Might also include certain standards. How long do you consider is sufficient for community facilitators to be trained, for example? So there might be already such documents in Tanzania that are that's not called the program implementation guideline, but may serve this purpose. So we will discuss that. Then a qualifications framework. Not all countries have a qualifications framework that take the kind of non-formal skills and qualifications that learners get into consideration and make pathways for that learning. Does it exist? Or are there other forms that give acknowledgement? What is the ideal around it? But how can we create pathways for learners that want to continue beyond maybe a non-formal course? Many learners are only interested in having that training for immediate livelihood purposes, which is also fine. But how do we take care of learners that want a pathway, especially when it comes to youth? The legal framework would refer to the ideal would be, of course, a law that actually make adult learning and education a law in the country. Very few countries in Africa have that. So what other legal frameworks exist? This might even be at local level. It might be legal frameworks around the roles of NGOs, etc. Does that give room for all of us to participate, to contribute towards the system? So what legal framework is there that guides the implementation of ALE? So that's the enabling environment 5 building blocks. For each of these elements, we agreed on 5 building blocks in the Africa team. There may be more, but we find most often many of the other issues people mention usually fit under one of these. And also why we agreed on this framework after a lot of trial and error over the 6 years was because it needs to be manageable when we want to build a system. So that's maybe another debate, but for now, this is what we have. And so institutional arrangements, I already referred to the implementation structures within organizations. The human resources, do we have sufficient staff? Do we have sufficient qualified staff? Most often, some positions may be vacant, or there's high staff turnover. I think all of you know how that impacts on delivering services on the ground. What kind of leadership and management are there? Do our leaders acknowledge the policy, interpret the policy, refer to the strategy when they guide their staff to implement? So the leadership and management is not always a tangible building block that is easily defined, but a very, very important one. And it links closely to the next one, accountability mechanisms. Which accountability mechanisms exist? If facilitators didn't conduct classes, if the supervisor didn't visit the facilitators in 2 or 3 months, is there any accountability? Or do we simply leave it as a poor service that was delivered and learners haven't seen their facilitator for some time? So just a small example to explain. And then very, very important, the partnership structures between state and non-state actors. This is a very important building block because those structures bring all stakeholders together, and it gives us a clear mandate of our roles that we play and how our roles contribute to the bigger system. So those are the 5 building blocks there. When we go to management processes, we refer to participatory planning. And this can be within your own institution, but also between these state and non-state actors. And I think many of you may have this experience. I have seen many, many times the benefit if you have participatory planning exercises on annual and quarterly basis between, for example, government and NGOs in a district, where everybody bring to the table what they can, discuss together, and then implement. So participatory planning processes not only within, but also between stakeholders. Appropriate budget and resource allocation, and this is often where we get stuck and say we can't do anything because we don't have budget or we don't have sufficient resources. And I think this will be something that will plague our sector for a time to come. But we also saw that when we start to analyze the system deeply, it's often not only about that. There are other blockages which can actually unblock this, but it remains an important building block. And how do we advocate for this? Monitoring and evaluation system. Do we have that? Do we have a national one? Do we have a local one? Do we have many? How do they intersect? And it also, of course, links to learner assessments. It links to the qualifications framework. So I think you can already see some building blocks coming together. The management information system. Is there a management information system within your own institution and at national level that captures all the data? Do we know how many learners attended literacy classes in Tanzania? How many learners attended non-formal skills training in any of the countries? Did they drop out? Did they complete? Type of quality, type of qualifications. So all of this has to go into a management information system. Uganda has started to design and pilot test a national management information system, which is not an easy task, but it is very interesting to learn from, and we will give opportunities for different countries to showcase different experiences around all these building blocks, because I hope that will also give ideas for alternative ways to try out new things. And then, of course, coordination and cooperation processes. And this refers literally to the process, because having the structure, if you look at the building block just left of that, partnership structures, having the structure doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening. Do these coordination structures meet? Do they have agendas that really address the reality? Do they keep minutes? Does any action emanate from this? Do they do joint monitoring? So what coordination and cooperation processes happen between the stakeholders? And then the last column, sorry, I hope you are still alive. I'm almost done with all the presentation stuff before we engaged. Localized curricula. Why do we say localized curricula as a building block under technical processes? This was also debated a lot by many of the teams in our bigger Africa team. Curricula should be relevant to what the target group needs. So whether you have a national qualifications framework, but at least you have a means at local level to contextualize, the emphasis is on having a curriculum and content that is in line with the target group and that is flexible enough to be updated on a regular basis. The ALE program design methodology refers to the type of methodologies you use to impart your learning, whether it is FAL, functional adult learning in education, in literacy, or reflect, or different approaches you may have in your vocational training, in your FTCs, in your CLCs, but having a concise learning methodology, not just an ad hoc process where a facilitator stands in front of a group, but a designed learning process. Yes, non-formal, but making sure the content is given in the correct way. Capacity development, I already mentioned this building block earlier. This is capacity development for everybody that is part of the system. Remember, I said in the ALESBA, we look more at the service suppliers, that is ourselves, and how do we deliver a relevant service? So how do we develop the capacity of all of the stakeholders, their individual staff, but also as institutions, to be able to deliver a proper service? So universities have a role to play, but even our institutions, we also have a role to play. Material development, this is not only the materials that we use to deliver the training or the services, so it's not only facilitators, guidelines, trainers, manuals, but it might also be the materials around monitoring and evaluation, guidelines how to plan, guidelines on how to work in a partnership. So any material that we use within the system. And then the last building block, learner assessments. Do we do learner assessments? I think you are familiar with the LAMP scale and the numeracy scale for literacy. What other forms of learner assessments do we do for non-formal skills training, for example, for life skills training, business skills training? And are those assessments acknowledged? How does it link with the qualifications framework? So these are the 20 building blocks altogether, so 5 per system element, and you don't have to study them by heart. They are in your booklets and we will engage with them, but it's important to just give you an overview, at least today. I think this is almost the last slide. I mentioned the system, the system building blocks and elements fall across all the spheres, and it acknowledges all the sectors as per the definition and scope of ALE. And as you guys said, not only ALE in Tanzania, you say ALE and non-formal. So what is the exact definition that will inform the kind of system you are looking at? The importance of partnerships I already mentioned. I think all of those have been emphasized, so let me not waste time. I'm going to stop share. No, I lie. I'm not going to stop share. I want to just highlight these few questions and then we can move into a discussion, but maybe first a body break. So actually, yes, let me stop share and hear from the team. I don't know if you have immediate questions or remarks or discomfort. And then we can do a body break if you want and have a bit of a discussion after. Or do you just want to go ahead? So please give me an indication of your feeling. My idea is to entertain general questions or comments and then to go in a little bit more specific and say, how does this apply to Tanzania? And how do you guys as a Tanzania team or any country team for that matter, how do you want to take the ALESBA and contextualize it over this course in your own context? So can I have some general questions, comments, remarks? And also to know if you want to break now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sonia, for the presentation. I would like to have just 5 or 2, whatever, but some few minutes break.
Let's do that. I think so too. I think most needed. It is now 20 past. Is 5 minutes enough, guys, or do you need 10?
Yes,